Hey gang, Julia Usher here, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I'm back with the second in my Spring Botanical series, and I'm making my favorite flowering spring tree of all, and that's the dogwood. I love the simplicity of the branch, just as it's beginning to bud, and the simplicity of the flower. To pay tribute to my favorite flowering tree, I am going to be hand piping every single petal, leaf, bud, branch, individually airbrushing every single piece and then piecing it all together on a finished stenciled cookie. So clearly this is a labor of love, much like the first in my series, the snowdrop. However, there are fewer petals on the dogwood, so if you're going to start anywhere, I'd start with this one. Let's get started and talk about what we'll need for this project. First, you'll need an iced cookie, at least one. I've iced mine in white and very, very pale blush to tie into some of the pale blush tones that are going to go on top of the dogwood. I want a very simple background, but something that's evocative of dogwood to tie into the floral element on top. And for that, I'm going to be airbrushing a very faint pattern on the back. We're going to be using my Victorian trellis stencil, which is available on my partner's site, confectioncouturestencils.com. We'll be airbrushing that with just a light haze of soft blue with a little bit of brown to antique it. So you'll need an airbrush. Then we'll be moving on to making the real focal point of this, which is the dimensional royal icing flower that goes on top. I love trying to coax royal icing into all sorts of interesting shapes and contours, and so this project is definitely an example of that. There's also a lot of fine piping involved, so consider this an exercise in getting practice in your piping skills. So we'll be making an assortment of small petals to form a bud, as well as centers to go inside the bud and inside the primary dogwood. We'll also be making bigger petals. Here they are partially formed into the dogwood already and airbrushed, and we'll eventually be placing a center into it here. When you're making these kinds of projects, I always start with a visual. If I don't have the actual plant in front of me, which I don't because it's winter here still, pull up an image off the internet. This one's especially good because it's a planar view. It's like head on to the dogwood, so I can see the actual shape of the petal and the leaf quite well, and it's going to serve as a tracing guide ultimately. Now, to create these fun contoured icing shapes, we of course need royal icing. I'll be calling that into the project as I need it. But to shape it, you're going to need an assortment of various things. Whole tubes for shaping the leaves, half tubes for shaping the big petals, and some acetate to pipe the royal icing on before it gets shaped around these things. You'll additionally need some tape to secure it to these tubes until it's dry, and then it'll come off. Now the branches, again, get examples where you can. I happen to have several dogwood trees in my yard. They're not flowering right now, but the branch structure is pretty much what it's going to be in the spring. So I pulled a few off, and that gave me an indication of what the branch structure, color, and buds look like. The branches are done a little bit differently because they're long and lanky and fragile. I do pipe them on parchment paper as opposed to acetate. They're a little bit easier to get off parchment paper without breaking. And the buds, the royal icing, are a completely different formulation of royal icing than you might be used to dealing with. It's what I call royal icing putty. It's extremely, extremely thick, thicker than my royal icing glue. So thick that you can mold it and shape it and form it into little objects. And these are some of the buds that I've created with it, now dry. I'll be showing you how to make all of these elements. Then as a finishing touch, in addition to the airbrushing to shade these things and give them dimension, I've got a little bit of tinted confectioner's sugar. This is just confectioner's sugar into which I rubbed a little bit of yellow food coloring, yellow liquid gel food coloring, until it was evenly distributed. If you don't add too much, it won't get too wet. Be careful, just add the coloring gradually. And this makes kind of a powder. I'm going to break that up and just use a few granules in the center of the dogwood to look like the emergence of, if you look at the flower carefully, there's a little tiny yellow floret that often springs forth from that center green area. So I'm going to sprinkle a few in there to be evocative of that, and also just to add a little more textural interest. Those are going to be adhered with just a teeny bit of corn syrup and a tiny little paintbrush. As I mentioned, we'll of course need airbrush colorings, not only for the background, but to shade these pieces, and some royal icing, and I'll introduce those as we need them. So let's move on to the first step, which is actually shaping some of the royal icing petals. So we're going to start with the smallest petal that forms the bud of the dogwood, kind of the emerging flower of the dogwood, if you will. And just to give you a frame of reference, I've pulled a picture, and this is what I mean by an emerging bud. I want you to take note that the shape of the petal is very different than the dogwood when it's fully open. When it's fully open, the dogwood has like a little dent in the middle of the petal. Here, instead, there's a little protrusion. So we're going to be shaping these over a dowel, and we're going to be creating a little point at the top. When we come to the dogwood flower, the fully open flower, we're going to be doing that a little bit differently. So to do that, I took that photograph, I reduced it to a size that I think is suitable for the bud, and I just redrew the shape of the petal a little bit to create that protrusion at the end. So I'm going to use this area as the template for these outer pieces. And when they're done, they're going to look something like this, curved that way. And 4 of them, once airbrushed, are going to come together to form a little bud like so. I say bud, I mean emerging flower, because I do have buds that are much smaller than this that we'll be doing too. So I'm using an icing of relatively thick flooding consistency here because I want the petal to have some body. I'm going to be tracing it with the same consistency as I'm flooding so that the outline and the inner part merge together nicely, just tracing over my template that sits underneath acetate. Now I'm using acetate because that way when I pull it off the acetate, the underside of the petal, which will be slightly exposed, will be shiny. And shinier is probably more realistic in this case than dull. I get a more dull effect if I were to use parchment paper. Now taking my trussing needle and teasing the icing into the small corners, I'd rather do that than risk overflowing the borders by piping more icing into it. I want to shape these petals in such a way that the best side, the outer side, faces up. And because these flowers will ultimately be curved up and relatively closed, that's why I'm shaping it on the outside. Now, once those are dry, ideally overnight, you can take them off the tube. You want to hold down the tape as you're taking off the acetate so they don't fly off inadvertently. Then you want to peel the acetate away from the tip of the petal so you don't risk breaking it. Now moving on to the bigger petals that have a slightly different shape. The process is fundamentally the same, except I'm going to be piping on top of them as well and shaping them a bit differently. Same thick flooding consistency icing here. Now, taking the acetate off the template, I'm going to shape it inside a tube rather than over it, as you can see. And that's because I want the right side facing up and these petals will be curving up in the final construction. Now, before the icing sets, I want to pipe some additional lines on top for more definition. I'm going to put 3 gently arcing lines on each side. This is the same consistency of icing, just passing through a much smaller opening so I get a fine line. And now, again, once those are dry, I can remove the tape, but hold down that acetate as you do that. And then, again, invert the petal over a soft surface and peel away from the top of the petal so you don't risk damaging the top. Now, as you can see, as I said before, the backside is quite shiny because I've piped on acetate, not parchment paper. So to pipe the leaves, I'm taking a template, again, derived from my drawing, and I'm going to be piping in light green and airbrushing later. You'll notice I have a central, very defined vein and some fainter ones to the side, and I'm going to show you how I do that. Again, using a thick flooding consistency to fill the leaf. And now I'm going to put some lines down to the outside. These are going to settle into that wet icing pretty quickly and become more faint, especially as I wrap them over the tube. I haven't yet laid down the center line because I want that to be more defined. I find if I put all the lines down first and then wrap, they all tend to settle into the underlying icing. But if I pipe that central line down later, you'll notice how much more defined it gets. So let's do that. I started one and it kind of broke, so I'm going to go over it. And pipe slowly so the line doesn't break. That looks good. And we'll set that aside to dry, again, ideally overnight. You can touch up things with your trussing needle if they're not perfect, of course. Now, once they're dry, you again want to remove them on a soft surface, holding down that tape on both sides so they don't fly off like that. You risk damaging them if you do. Here I'm just showing one that has less defined lines to the sides on the right and more defined lines on the left. That's because I piped all those lines later on the left-hand leaf. But removing them again, just pull away from the tip of the leaf and you'll have a beautiful leaf when you're done. Now let's move on to those centers. They're going to be done in 2 sizes, a small size which consists of a dot in the center and 5 or 6 other dots around the edge. Now I want these dots to have peaks, so I'm using a relatively thick icing and a number 1 tip here. For the bigger centers, I'm just going to go around the outside one more time and add another 10 or 11 dots around the smaller piece that I created for the smaller flower. Again, dry them overnight and they will literally pop off that acetate with no trouble. Onto the branches for the dogwood. Here's the actual branch I plucked from my tree in the yard. And as you can see, it's got a V structure with a central piece that comes up through the middle of the V. I'm going to take a little bit of artistic license with this. When I did this in test mode, I didn't like how this looked when I piped it in that structure. It looked kind of like a fork. It didn't look altogether too graceful. So I ended up tweaking it a little bit and doing kind of a staggered V, if you will. I just think that looks a little bit better in the design. So this isn't intended to be perfectly botanically correct, but it's supposed to come close. I also chose a gray-brown color. This is a mixture of black and brown. But to pipe it, because it's long and delicate, I want to do it on parchment paper. If I do it on acetate, it's possible, but it takes longer to dry. Acetate's not quite as pliable. The royal icing doesn't recede from acetate as readily as it does from parchment paper. So if I pipe on parchment paper, as soon as it's dry, these pieces will literally kind of fall off like this. So I'm using a relatively thick icing here of piping consistency because I want this branch to be very defined and for the line to hold its shape. I'm using a number 5 Wilton tip for the big branches, and I'll use a Wilton number 4 for some smaller branches a bit later. So you'll notice when I'm piping, I apply a bit more pressure at the start to create a joint, go a little distance, then apply a little more pressure to create another joint. We want these branches to look a little gnarly. We don't want them uniformly straight. And then I ease off pressure on the end to create a point at the end of the branch. So one more time, apply pressure, go more uniformly, apply a little more pressure for a joint, more uniformly, and then ease off to a point. And if you don't like how things are, you can touch them up with your trussing needle or a paintbrush. And then simply to shape these, I'm just removing the magnets which were weighing down the parchment paper and giving that parchment paper a little bit of a curl, and that will give the branch a nice natural arch. So let's move on to the buds. Okay, to make these, I'm going to use royal icing putty, and by that I mean royal icing that's so thick that it clings to the spoon and barely sticks to my hands when I touch it, so I can actually model with it. So I simply take my thick royal icing glue and add even more powdered sugar to it. Now, if the icing's still a little bit sticky, be fearless about dusting those hands because you don't really want the icing sticking to your hands. I'm just going to take a teeny little bit and roll them all into little balls, and then use my paring knife to score a little X in the top. This will flatten the ball a little bit, which is perfect because that's how those buds look. They're a little bit flattened. And I'm doing this on acetate because they're going to be tacky, and when they dry, I want them to pop right off the acetate without sticking to cardboard or something else. And that's how they'll look when completely dry. So now we're ready to color all the royal icing transfers that are now dry and off of their various forms. And the first one I want to start with is the emerging dogwood. Before it comes together in this form, each petal has to be individually airbrushed. They get a spritz of light pink in the center, and they have different patterns on the outside. 2 of the petals on the outside have more brown running through the center with green to the outside, and the other 2 opposing petals have more brown towards the bottom with green towards the top. And this pattern was done more or less to suggest what you see as an actual pattern on the dogwood itself. You can see that the placement of the brown and the green alternates as you go around the dogwood. So we're going to start by airbrushing the insides of these petals. So I'm holding the tips of the petals, the uppermost part, because I just want to airbrush the inside. And you'll want to put on gloves for this so you don't get your fingers all airbrushed. So again, holding the pointy end of the petal so it doesn't get airbrush coloring on it, I'm just going to hit about the lower half of the petal with pale pink. I'm shading at a distance because I want it to be, again, very pale. I don't want it too saturated, and you run the risk of that if you airbrush too close. So again, very, very light touch on the airbrush and airbrushing at a distance. You need 4 petals for each of these little emerging flowers. I've only done 2 here. I'm going to move now onto the outsides of the petals, airbrushing the first style, which has the brown stripe down the center, and then touching the tip with brown as well to accentuate it. Moving on to the second style, the brown is actually at the base of the petal. So I'm going to use my fingers, pinching them together as kind of a stencil to create that sort of shape of brown at the bottom of the petal. Let me just repeat that and show you that one more time. Again, pinching an area off at the bottom of the petal, and that brown area should coincide with the pink on the inside. Again, I want to hit the tips of the petals to give them a little more definition, and for this I airbrush almost directly overhead so I don't get airbrush coloring on the inside of the petal. That looks great. Now we have yet to apply green to the outsides of both styles of petal, and I'm using an electric green for this. Again, spraying at a distance, just hitting the white parts lightly. And it doesn't matter if the green goes into the brown, because a little bit of blending here is going to look completely natural. That completes 2 of the petals. I want to do the other 2 as well. And if you have to hold the petal down, which you will, because they'll blow around due to the force of the airbrush, hold them by the bottom or base of the petal, because any fingerprint void you leave there will be less likely to show in the final construction. So there they are, the 2 styles that were pinched off, and also the 2 styles with the stripes down the center. They look great, and just flipping them over, you can see that the pink corresponds to the bottom of the petal in each case. Now, on to the centers. Again, we have big ones for the big flowers and small ones for the smaller flowers. And we want to do both in basically the same way. I'm doing a smaller one now. I'm going to start by hitting it with some avocado green. I'm spraying from the side just to give it a little bit of shadowing. I don't want to spray directly overhead because that'll fill the entire piece with color, and we just want accents or shadowing from the sides. I'm going to do the same now on the big pieces, which recall just have an extra row of dots around them. And I'm going to apply brown as a second color to give it even more depth and dimension. Spraying in basically the same way, just hitting them from the sides, maybe in slightly different areas than I hit them with the green, but a little bit of overlapping of colors will also look very natural here. The key thing is just to not airbrush from overhead, because you don't want to completely fill with coloring or you'll end up losing definition rather than highlighting the definition. They do love to blow around, so use that turkey lacer to hold them in place. Now onto the big petals for the big open dogwood. I only have to airbrush one side now because in the final construction, the petal will be facing pretty much largely up. So I'm going to hit the bottom with a little bit of light pink as I did before, but I'm going to come in and also hit it with a little bit of dark pink at the very, very tip. Again, holding the petal from the top because we don't want the top pink. I do want to get that edge again to really define it, especially the notch in the edge. So I'm going to start by hitting it with a little bit of light green, extending beyond the notch on one side over to just beyond it on the other. Again, airbrushing from directly overhead. Now coming in with a brown to just hit that notch and really accentuate it. And once again, you'll need 4 of these petals for each flower. So let's move on to the leaves. Let me move some into view. They are going to be done in basically the same way as the centers, with the same 2 colors, avocado and harvest brown, and mostly airbrushed from the sides so we pick up some definition on the edges of the leaves. I'm going to take a plain leaf and start with the avocado, again, hitting the side at a distance so I get a light shading and not a lot of saturation, leaving a highlight of the original color in the center of the leaves. The difference here is I also want to get the back just with the green. The back will show in most configurations on the final cookie, so I want to make sure it doesn't look too light. Small leaves would be done exactly the same way, just touching them from the sides and also on the back. And now we want to come in with a touch of brown on the very, very edge just to give a little more accentuation to that edge. And to do that, I'm airbrushing directly overhead the edge with light pullback on the trigger, just so I don't airbrush too much of the front of the leaf. I'm working on a small leaf now. It's a little harder to control the brown on it. I got a little much on that one, but that's okay because a little bit of variation on these leaves is going to look completely natural. Here's a finished set looking pretty nice. Now for the branches, the big ones, I like to place them on the actual cookie first because their orientation on the cookie will determine where I put the shading. I want to be shading underneath the branch. But first let me do a few small branches. The shading here matters less. I'm just shooting them from the side with a little bit of brown. Now, I want the shading on the left side of this one because it's going to arc left and that's going to be the underside of the branch. I'm going to do a few of these and then I'm going to hit them with a little black at those joints just for added definition. Again, just a little bit of black at those joints to give it more oomph. And I've got a couple of finished pieces here which will give me plenty to work with when I get to arranging them on the cookie. Now lastly for the buds, I'm going to hit them from the side with a little bit of brown and then also with a little bit of electric green. I want to hit the bottoms of them a bit too because some of that may show in the final construction. And there you have it, some buds all finished along with some tiny little branches. Looking good. So that completes the airbrushing of all the component pieces. I did a bunch, so I think I'm gonna have enough selection to at least arrange a couple of cookies from it, but we'll see. Now it's time though to assemble the dogwood flowers and the dogwood emerging flowers. Now, before I can put any of the flowers together, I have to finish the centers, and I want to add the little powdered sugar granules to them that are supposed to represent little florets emerging from the centers, or maybe even pollen. Now recall that yellow powdered sugar was made by putting it in a small baggie, adding a touch of yellow liquid gel coloring or soft gel, and just massaging it until the color was uniform. Don't add too much or the powdered sugar is going to get really lumpy. Now to apply it, I just add a little bit of corn syrup with a brush where I want it on the center, and then drop the powdered sugar granule onto it. 2 or 3% is about right. Now we're ready to assemble the small flower. Remember, the pink goes towards the inside or center of the flower. I'm assembling on acetate because I need to get this up later. If I were to assemble on cardboard, it would dry, but I'd have trouble getting it off the cardboard. So I'm putting just a touch of my thick royal icing glue in the center and making sure the pink points of the petals all make contact with that icing. Less is more as far as the icing goes because you really don't want to see it, and I'm using white because it's less likely to show in the final construction. Now once those are all in place, I'm adding another little touch of icing at the top to which I'm going to secure one of the small centers. Again, the small centers go in these small florets. Just press it down a bit with my trussing needle so it sits level. And as you notice, the flower is wide open. These are supposed to be emerging flowers though, so we need to prop those petals up. And to do that, I'm using couplers. You can also use pastry tips just to slide the petals up. I generally do one and then do the one that directly opposes it and then do the other two. That's in good position, and I'll leave it there until it dries completely, which is ideally overnight. And then just take the tip of a paring knife and gently push off the dry flower, and you end up with something that looks like that. Now onto the big flower. It gets assembled pretty much the same way, except I'm going to leave it more open. So just a touch of thick royal icing glue in the center, to which I'm securing the pink sides of the petals. And I could raise it up and prop it up as I did the other. Let's see what that looks like. Again, raising petals from opposing sides. That way the petals are less likely to shift around. That looks too close for me, so I'm going to take those out and just let them fall naturally to the sides. Put a little icing on top and then put the large center in place. And that looks good. And once that's dry, we can remove it from the acetate. With all of our royal icing parts piped and off drying, it's time to prepare our background for our dimensional dogwood. And I want to keep the background very simple, just very, very soft, subtle suggestion of pattern so that the dogwood remains the focal point. The actual pattern I'm stenciling on is sort of evocative of dogwood. It's got 6 petals instead of 4, but it's that same basic form, and it's got some curly cues that mimic sort of the starkness of the dogwood branches, which is why I chose it. Again, this is my Victorian trellis stencil that you can find on my partner confectioncouturestencils.com. So the first step with stenciling anything is to secure that background stencil in a stencil genie or frame so it lays flat against the cookie. I'm just hitting half the cookie here. I want half plane to receive the flower. I don't want the background really interfering with it. The pattern will be off to the other side of the flower. I hit it with both blue and light brown, just slightly. So that's really soft and delicate. You can go a little more heavy-handed, exact same colors, and get a little bit more contrast, but I wouldn't go any darker than that. I'll probably end up decorating on this cookie. I'm gonna start by arranging all my component pieces on here the way I want them, and then selectively airbrush those that I know I'm gonna place on the cookie. I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting super excited. The dogwood have now taken shape, the flowers themselves. They're very dimensional, and the whole project's gonna take on even more life and dimension as we start assembling all the pieces on the cookie. In most cases, I start by anchoring the main branch first, then the main dogwood, and then I piece everything in around it, working large to small. At the end, I determine whether I wanna have a border. This is so beautiful without any border on the cookie. So if I do one at all, I want to keep it pretty subtle, as I did on this side here, just really pale pink dots. But I think I'm going to go the borderless route and keep it pretty straightforward. Okay, so I teased you with some gorgeous cookies earlier. Now I want to show you step by step how I put them together. It's nothing more than a pasting process, but first you want to arrange all the elements on the cookie without any icing glue to get the arrangement you want, then set them aside, then start gluing, just as I glued down this first branch. I'm using thick royal icing glue. Now, for the next largest piece, the dogwood flower, I want it to meet the twig or the branch, and as you'll notice, that branch is off the surface of the cookie at the base. So I'm actually propping it up with a bit of fondant. I will use fondant from time to time to prop things up if need be. Sticking the fondant down with royal icing to the cookie, then a little bit of icing on top of the fondant to secure the piece to it. Now for the leaf, I needed no lifting, so I just attached it directly to the cookie with royal icing. For this small leaf at the tip, I do also want to give it a little more lift, so I'm going to tuck just a teeny bit of fondant underneath it so it doesn't lay flat against the cookie. And in this case, whenever assembling, less is more, whether it be applying fondant or icing. You don't want to see it, so use teeny bits of it. And you want to use a thick royal icing glue. The thicker the icing is, the faster it'll dry, and the less likely the other pieces are to slide around on you as you're arranging them. Now, progressing to my smaller pieces, again, I like to arrange from big to small, using small things to fill in gaps. Moving on to twigs, I'm now going to place a small floret here at the joint in the branch just to add a little more color. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to hold these flowers delicately and gently. Do not apply too much pressure. I'm just applying the very slightest bit of pressure to situate those in place. Otherwise, you're likely to break off the petals. Now, the last thing I want to apply are the buds, and to do that, I'm using a thick brown royal icing. I want to match the royal icing to the branch or the twig. Otherwise, we're going to see white there. General rule of thumb is to match the icing to whatever it is you're gluing to. Well, I'm feeling pretty self-satisfied, if I do say so myself. I've now made a bunch of these, and each one is as beautiful as the next. I did, however, want to pause and point to a couple of style variations before I let you go, just to spark more possibilities for you all. So what you see here are two cookies. This one to the right is very similar to what I did in the video. It's got a white background with the blue airbrushing on top. Here, the only difference is I changed out the background color of the icing, so it's pale pink. And because the dogwood has a little white accent, I didn't airbrush fully to the edge of the petal. That white accent at the edge of the petal is just enough to offset the otherwise pink flower from the pink background. I think that looks really subtle. The other thing to point out is no two cookies are alike. This one has the little buds and two dogwoods. This has the emerging flower and a dogwood and no buds. But you can't go wrong, really. The beauty of these pieces is they're designed to look like nature. They're designed to be very organic. So almost any arrangement looks great as long as you conceal the intersection points, which I do skillfully by putting flowers or leaves on top of the icing glue. Believe it or not, as these flowers go, the dogwood here are relatively simple. They're only a 4-petal flower. If you think you're now ready for a bigger challenge, you might jump on over to the snowdrop. It actually has 5 or 6 petals depending on the configuration of the flower. So I encourage you to give it a shot. Till next video, live sweetly.